The 2020 fantasy football season is over. So guess what that means? Let's look ahead to 2021. I know we've all been doing that, but for fantasy specifically, it is never too early to draft. Of course, I'm talking about a mock draft. Chris and I are already on the clock in our latest PPR mock for the 2021 season. We're going to break down the first round for you. Now, I know there's been some healthy debate about who should be number one. I know for you, Chris, it's kind of a no-brainer, though.
Yeah, if you watched my Who Should Be Number One video, you know who I think should be number one, and that's Christian McCaffrey. And indeed, he was the number one pick in this draft. I explained why in there. I won't go too much into it, but let's just say Christian McCaffrey, in the 3 games he played, averaged 30 points per game and never scored less than 25 points per game. I mean, he's basically untouchable in the number one spot, in my opinion.
Yeah, not a surprise to see him number one. Again, some people might be scared off because of the injury, but this wasn't, a serious season-ending injury. I think that Carolina just kind of played it safe with him. So I agree. I think it's got to be him, and he was number one. I drew the number 2 pick in this draft. I went with Dalvin Cook. Let me just say Dalvin Cook was a stud all season long. He's a guy who I really had pegged as a top running back behind Christian McCaffrey this season, and he didn't disappoint. This is a team that's still going to be run heavy. So I feel like Cook was pretty solid pick at number 2.
Yeah, I completely agree. And again, if you watch that video, I had Dalvin Cook at number 2 ahead of Alvin Kamara for the reasons we're going to discuss briefly here. I thought Dalvin Cook at number 2 was the obvious pick. So right there with you on that one.
All right. Well, that's good to know. Number 3 was Kamara. I can see that a lot of drafts, maybe he'll go number 2, maybe even number 1 in some leagues. But I think 3 is probably the highest I would pick him.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see a shift here as the offseason goes on. It's easy right now, coming off that massive Week 16. He won your championship game, to think, oh, Alvin Kamara, number 1, number 2, number 3. But there's reports that Drew Brees is going to retire after the season. And, if we're going to get a full 16 games of Alvin Kamara with Taysom Hill, he definitely is not a top 3 pick for me. And I don't even know if he'll be inside the top 10. Now, this is a debate for another video, but it's why I can't put Alvin Kamara ahead of guys like McCaffrey and Dalvin Cook right this second.
Yeah, now I'm with you on that line of thinking. I could see keeping him outside the top 5 because there's other players we're about to talk about, that could have more value. Outside the top 10, that's a little bold for me because he brings that floor, as a pass catcher. But then again, like you said, that's with Brees at quarterback. Maybe a different story next year, but we'll have to see how things play out. So at number 4, last year's pick, who was a lot of times debated as possibly the number 1. You know what? There were a lot of leagues where I saw Saquon Barkley was the number 1 pick ahead of Christian McCaffrey. Saquon Barkley at number 4, is that still risky based on the injury history that he has? Or do you think maybe this is a steal because this is a guy who could be the number 1 pick, at least number 2?
Yeah, again, in my Who Should Be Number 1, I had Saquon Barkley slotted in right at number 4. Now, I think you can make a case for him, Davante Adams, or Derrick Henry in any order here as far as 4 through 6 goes. He just comes with such a high floor and such a high ceiling that I do feel like at 4, he almost is kind of a steal.
Yeah, think about it. I mean, not a massive drop in value there, but still a guy who, again, was the top pick overall in a lot of 2020 drafts. Number 4, if you can get that same player, assuming he's 100%, in terms of not just health, but explosiveness, that could be your league winner right there. Now, you did have the number 5 pick, and you, who I've, given you the name Mr. Zero RB, you didn't go with a running back in the first round in the top 5.
No, and again, in that video, I had Davante Adams 5th, and to me, Davante Adams is 5th, and he could arguably be even higher. So I was happy to take Davante Adams here. Now, like I said, if Saquon Barkley was still there, like let's say the number 4 player had taken Derrick Henry, I would have taken Saquon Barkley here ahead of Davante Adams. But at this point, I can't not take Davante Adams. Again, if somebody else thinks Derrick Henry should go before Davante Adams, I'm totally okay with that. But me personally, I'd rather have the number 1 wide receiver than the number 5 or 6 running back. So for me, this was Davante Adams. No brainer for me.
and it's hard to criticize or to pick anything apart as far as taking Davante Adams. Obviously, the top wide receiver by a wide margin this year. The only thing maybe is okay. Well, a lot of people thought, well, take a wide receiver. That's safer, right? This year, so a lot of people at that number 5 spot, exactly, maybe 6 or 7, took Michael Thomas, thinking this is the safest pick there is. I'm not getting a running back who could get hurt or could drop off. And then Michael Thomas wound up screwing a lot of people over, partly because he was injured, but partly when he was playing, I mean, he didn't really have that same type of production. Didn't score a touchdown all year, even when he did play. And so, Adams does have a history of missing games, a couple games here, a couple games last year. Any concern about that? The fact that maybe taking a wide receiver just in and of itself isn't as valuable if he isn't the number 1 guy, just because, again, everybody else is taking running back. So are you worried about coming back the next round or two and you just don't have an RB1?
No, because I'm very comfortable waiting on running back. And I know once I make that decision to take Davante Adams, I'm probably not going to take a running back for a while. And when you talk about injuries, I mean, look at last year. If you had the number 1 pick, you lost McCaffrey. If you had the number 2 pick, you lost Saquon Barkley. If you had the number 3 pick, you weren't very happy with Ezekiel Elliott. Right. So it's not like there isn't risk everywhere when it comes to injury. So I don't look at that. I look at more as like, who do I feel has the most value here? Who do I feel, gives me the upside? And that's Davante Adams.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, it's hard to criticize taking Adams based on how he performs. He's still tied to maybe the best quarterback in the game, still Aaron Rodgers. So can't disagree there. Now, speaking of Derrick Henry, he did go number 6. That might actually seem like great value for a guy that, again, for the second straight year, led the league in rushing and went over 2,000 yards. And, oh, by the way, scored 17 touchdowns. At number 6, actually kind of seems like a bargain. But we kind of have to say the same thing as last year, which maybe he's proven it just really doesn't matter. Not a big floor in terms of, not having those pass catching stats in PPR when he does have a bad game, which is rare, but he really is not going to give you too much in those games. Also, we have to mention this is a guy who, coming off that 300 carry season the year before, he did it even more this year, 378 carries. I mean, are we worried that this guy is ever going to wear down, that wear and tear, or is he just one of those guys where it really doesn't matter?
I mean, at this point, I'm starting to lean that he's just an anomaly and a freak. So you're talking about a 27-year-old running back with back-to-back 300-yard carries under his belt. You got to think he's going to slow down. But at the same time, he doesn't ever slow down. So he could just be one of those freak anomalies who never slows down, which is why I took Davante Adams over him. But again, when it comes to Barkley, Adams, and Henry, 4 through 6, I'm not going to argue with whatever order people take him in. I do think they are the for sure top 6, and they're in a tier of their own. I do think there's a pretty decent drop off after this tier. And if you want to take Henry at 4 or Adams at 4, I'm never going to argue with you on that.
Agree. I mean, it's hard, as far as which guy goes in which spot. I mean, you're splitting hairs here because these are all should be fantasy studs. Henry seems like probably the safest pick, though, I would say, out of that group. So there's that. Before we get to the rest of the first round picks, don't forget, hit that subscribe button and click the notification bell so you catch all of our videos as soon as they drop. And then Chubb is a pretty safe pick. Of course, he did miss some time, some games this year due to injury. That can happen to any player, but Nick Chubb, maybe just a slightly lighter version of Derrick Henry, not a prolific pass catcher, but it doesn't seem to matter. He rips off big runs, gets 100-yard games kind of at will. Any qualm with Nick Chubb going number 7? I feel like he's going to be a top 10 pick everywhere too.
Oh, for sure. I mean, he's still topped 1,000 yards this season, despite missing 4 games with that injury. And with Kareem Hunt there, which was my big concern going into 2020 was Kareem Hunt. And now look, Kareem Hunt, whether you want to admit it or not, does impact Nick Chubb's ceiling, because instead of getting 20 plus carries every week, he gets, 15-ish. But for Nick Chubb, that's enough, especially in this offense who wants to run the ball. He gets touchdowns. Not going to argue with Nick Chubb at number 7. No.
Yeah, no argument there. Now, you may have some issue with this next pick, Ezekiel Elliott. Is he still a top 10 pick. Some might say maybe he's not even a first rounder. Obviously, the Dak Prescott injury impacted that whole offense. Zeke was banged up here and there at times too. But there were some times where he just didn't look like himself. So I wonder, this is still a young running back. I know he also has some tread on his tires. But still, this is one of the few workhorse backs in the league. So how do you feel about Zeke still being in the top 10?
Yeah, Zeke is interesting for me because this is one of those picks that's either we're going to look back on and be like, what were we thinking drafting Zeke in the top 10? Or we're going to look back and think like, why did we let Zeke drop this far in drafts? Why were we not drafting him in the top 5? Because if you look at Ezekiel Elliott in the games with Dak Prescott, his expected fantasy points per game was 24.4 in PPR leagues. And without Dak Prescott, it was only 16.3. And if the usage he got over these last 2 weeks after he missed that game with injury is any indication, then all the fears about Tony Pollard taking his job were way overblown. So if assuming Dak Prescott is healthy, which we have to assume, and assuming that Ezekiel Elliott is still the guy, this could be the steal of the first round. So don't hate the pick. I mean, there's definitely some risk in it, which I'm usually pretty risk averse when it comes to my first round picks, but could be the steal of the draft, or the first round, I should say.
Yeah, and also besides the Prescott injury, you should mention the fact that the Cowboys had a really bad defense. That affects the running game, of course, when you're constantly having to not only play from behind, but try to generate offense quickly because you can't establish the run, you can't afford to milk the clock. And so it wasn't the same. If they can add some pieces through the draft, they actually have a top 10 draft pick through free agency. We know Jerry Jones has no problem opening up the wallet. So if they can keep their guys healthy and improve that defense, I think that also helps Zeke. All right. And then the number 9 pick, I won't call it a reach because this guy was pretty much a first rounder unanimously this season. So going into next season is Josh Jacobs, still a first rounder. He ended the season on a pretty strong note, of course. Week 17 didn't really matter that much. But he also might be one of those few guys who still qualifies as a workhorse. So that alone, I guess, makes him first round worthy.
Well, honestly, this was the first pick I'm not going to say I had an issue with. I mean, it's not a terrible pick. Obviously, Josh Jacobs is good. We know that. I'm not going to, say I didn't. But I find it questionable that Josh Jacobs is a first rounder, especially when we look at the other running backs behind him. Over his career, he's only averaged 14.7 PPR points per game. And I mean, that's not terrible, but that's not really what you're looking for out of your first rounder, right? We're looking for a high 15 plus point floor with those massive 20, 30 point ceiling games. And he just doesn't really get you that. And there's weeks where, the Raiders give Devontae Booker a bunch of touches or Jalen Richard a bunch of touches, or he's not involved in the passing game. We had reports last year, remember, that, the Raiders are going to throw the ball to him more. And then he caught a bunch of passes against Carolina in week 1. And everybody was like, see. And then he didn't do anything or didn't do much in the passing game the rest of the year. So this to me was the first kind of questionable pick. I mean, I'm not like anti-Josh Jacobs or anything. I just think there are other running backs behind him that I would have definitely picked ahead of him, or maybe even gone with a wide receiver here. But, it's not a terrible pick. He definitely is relatively safe.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. You kind of want to play it safe in the first round, right? Like as you always say, you can't necessarily win with your first pick league, but you can lose it. You lose your first round guy. He's proven to be durable. Like I said, we know he's going to get a ton of touches. The question is, does he have the same ceiling as some of these other guys? And I'm not quite sure. All right, and then number 10 pick. Honestly, I thought that Jonathan Taylor would even go sooner. Obviously, the hype has been real since he was drafted by the Colts, and then so disappointing the first half of the season, and then incredible the second half of the season. Still has it going. We'll see what he does in the playoffs, but based on how he finished the year, especially that monster Week 17 performance, I really think Taylor is going to be not just a first rounder. I think that he's going to catch up to a lot of those guys, maybe go as high as 7 or 8 in some drafts. So to get him at 10, I mean, do you feel like maybe that's a little bit too much hype, or you think that he's legitimately earned that spot?
I think he's legitimately earned it, and I'm with you. This is the thing. Do they keep Marlon Mack? Do they re-sign Jordan Wilkins? What do they do? Or do they really show us that they have confidence that Jonathan Taylor is the guy? Because let's not forget, they lost Marlon Mack for the season to injury. Jordan Wilkins was banged up down the stretch. So did they see enough from Jonathan Taylor to say, you know what, we are set at running back. We don't have to worry about it. He's our guy. Let's roll into 2021 with just him and maybe like some, random free agent or some random late round draft pick or whatever it might be? Or do they re-sign these guys and kind of put up a little bit of red flags like, hey, we're not quite sure Jonathan Taylor can hold up over an entire season the way, he did down the stretch. Maybe we want to, ease the load off him. So he's one of those guys that definitely is going to either skyrocket up draft boards or fall down draft boards. But I think right now, 10th is great value for him because it's looking really good. And if they don't bring Marlon back or Jordan Wilkins back next year and they say he's our guy, I agree with you. He could creep into that top 6, maybe even that top 5.
And I bet he will. People love their young running backs. Of course, it depends which rookie in this upcoming draft class lands where. That overtakes all these guys and becomes, kind of the flavor of the year. Number 11, it was interesting. I'm not really sure how to feel about this pick. Honestly, Austin Ekeler taken at the 11th pick. On the one hand, I mean, he's probably the guy there. I don't see the Chargers going out and adding anybody necessarily at running back through free agency or especially the draft again. They already got Joshua Kelly, who was disappointing, but still, it's not an area of need. I feel like they addressed the offensive line this offseason, especially in the draft. So that's a good thing. And of course, Anthony Lynn, no longer the head coach there. That should be a good thing for this team in general, especially on the offense. But on the other hand, I mean, maybe we've seen the best of him. I don't feel like he really qualifies as a workhorse or necessarily is going to deliver first round value. So kind of on the fence about whether this pick was good or not.
I like Ekeler. I like this pick. He was 5th among all running backs in expected PPR points per game this year with 19.2. We saw once Justin Herbert came in, one thing about Justin Herbert, for as good as he's been, he will check the ball down quite a bit to the running backs, and that helps Austin Ekeler, especially in PPR leagues. Now, I wouldn't be as high on Ekeler in a standard scoring league, but this is a PPR mock draft. So in PPR, I love Austin Ekeler. I definitely think he's a first rounder. In the 8 healthy games this year, he averaged 20 PPR points per game. I know he was a little up and down, but still, he offers a relatively safe floor with a nice ceiling. I think Austin Ekeler at the end of the first round is a fine pick. I'm totally okay with it. And I would honestly pick him over Josh Jacobs for sure.
Well, there you go. And now, after the first 11 picks, there were 10 running backs taken and 1 receiver. That was you. The last pick, guess what? It was a running back. So, which running back was it? Because there's a lot of names left. Believe it or not Aaron Jones, not a first-round pick. Not Miles Sanders. He's dropped out of the first-round conversation. Not James Robinson, who was one of the top 5 fantasy running backs this season. It was DeAndre Swift. How do you feel about DeAndre Swift creeping in the first round?
This was probably the most surprising first-round pick to me. And the person who made this pick, I really respect. We've had him on the show before. He's really good. He knows his stuff. So it makes me kind of think, am I missing something here? It's not that he's a bad player, because he's not. I think he's a good player. It's the situation. In order for DeAndre Swift to pay off first round value, we're going to have to know that the Lions are willing to commit to him as the guy. And we did not see that this year. I mean, he was playing behind or splitting carries with an very aging, very old Adrian Peterson. And that to me is not a good sign when you can't really pull away from Adrian Peterson in the backfield. Now, will Adrian Peterson be back next year? Maybe not. But that won't stop them from potentially bringing in another veteran running back to take carries away from him, to take snaps away from him. I just can't get behind this pick. Again, not because of the player, simply because of the situation that he's in there in Detroit. So yeah, unless we get real confirmation where, we go through the free agency and we go through the NFL draft and it's like, oh, hey, DeAndre Swift is the only guy still in Detroit, then I'd be like, okay, now it makes sense as a first rounder. But as of right now, this pick was very surprising to me.
Yeah, even then, I mean, even if they do nothing, it's the exact same situation. I still can't get behind him as a first round pick. So here's the thing. Like you said, people were screaming, free DeAndre Swift all year long. Just give him the ball, let him be the guy. Well, even when he was mostly the guy, we had this one explosive game. But toward the end of the season, when they kind of at least, cut down on Peterson's touches, Swift didn't really go off. I mean, he didn't really take advantage. He was mostly touchdown dependent for fantasy value. And I know he's a great player, but here's the thing. What's going to happen? We're going to get probably a new coach in Detroit. If we don't, maybe they keep Evel and he's still the coach. Well, then we're going to see more of what we saw, which means he's going to be a good RB2, but not a first round pick and not an RB1 for fantasy. And here's the other thing that worries me. I think really the way things have gone, as long as Matthew Stafford is there, this team will live and die by the pass. He's just one of those quarterbacks that needs to pass the ball at a high rate because he wants to. Kind of like with the Steelers and Ben Roethlisberger, as long as he's there, he's going to call his own number more often than not. It's going to be a pass-heavy attack. And that's not a bad thing. We've seen Stafford. I mean, he's a gamer, and he can definitely carry the team. Hopefully they improve the defense so that he doesn't have to. But still, I can't get behind this pick. I don't think he's ever going to see the volume of touches to put him, as an RB1 for fantasy. So I would have preferred him much later in the second round. All right, so that's the first round of our PPR mock, and still going on this thing. We'll see how it turns out, trying to do some early research to help you guys out, and we'll talk about maybe the rest of the rounds at a later time, but do check that out. So that does it for this episode of Fantasy Endgame. Don't forget, hit that subscribe button. We're going to deliver off-season content all throughout 2021 preseason to help you out. All right, thanks for watching.